Mafia boss ordered his guards to follow his maid. What she did that night left him shocked. Darian Voss ruled Aurelia with an iron fist, until one order changed everything. Follow her. Don't be seen. He thought his maid was stealing from him. He was wrong. What she did that night didn't just save his man's life. It shattered every wall he'd built around his heart. This is the story of a kingpin who learned that the most dangerous thing in his world wasn't his enemies. It was a woman who refused to be afraid. The story doesn't end here. Subscribe to Mafia Soul to see what happened next, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Rain hammered the streets of Aurelia like a warning, turning cobblestones into mirrors that reflected the city's neon-lit sins. This was a place where fear had a name, whispered in back alleys and boardrooms alike. Darian Voss. Inside his glass-walled office overlooking the restless city, Darian stood with his back to three men who wouldn't dare sit without permission. Rico, Tane, and Merrick, his most trusted enforcers, waited in silence as their boss nursed a glass of whiskey, ice clinking against crystal. The shipment disappeared before it reached the warehouse, Darian said, his voice low and measured. Someone talked. Someone always talks. His reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a man carved from violence and control. Tattoos snaked up his neck, disappearing beneath an impeccably tailored suit. At 34, he'd built an empire on the bones of those who'd underestimated him. We've questioned everyone, Rico offered carefully. Then we haven't questioned the right people. Darian turned, his dark eyes scanning the mansion's dim hallways beyond the office door. What about the staff? Boss, they're vetted. People lie on paper. Movement caught his attention. Through the office's glass partition, he watched Sarah Demore gather cleaning supplies from the hallway closet. She moved like water, efficient and soundless, her dark hair tied back in a simple bun. For 6 months, she'd worked in his home, polishing floors he walked on, washing dishes he ate from, existing in the margins of his world. Invisible. Almost. But lately, Darian had noticed things. The way she stayed late when others left. How she avoided eye contact, yet somehow saw everything. Her tired glances that could mean exhaustion or guilt. She closed the closet door and headed toward the exit, pulling a worn coat around her shoulders. Her, Darian said suddenly. The three men followed his gaze. The maid. Tane frowned. Sarah Demore. She's been staying late. Watching. Darian set his glass down with deliberate precision. Follow her home tonight. Stay back. Don't let her see you. You think she's. I think everyone's capable of betrayal until they prove otherwise. His tone was cold, final. But as Sarah disappeared through the front entrance into the storm, Darian's reflection in the window revealed something he'd never admit. His gaze lingered. Not with suspicion alone, but with something quieter, more dangerous. Curiosity. Minutes later, Rico's black SUV idled at the corner, headlights cutting through the downpour. Ahead, a solitary figure walked beneath a small umbrella, her silhouette fragile against the city's brutality. Sarah Demore turned the corner, unaware that tonight, her shadow belonged to the Voss syndicate. And by morning, everything would change. The fog rolled in thick, swallowing streetlights whole, and turning Aurelia's back streets into a maze of shadows. Sarah Demore kept her pace steady, umbrella angled against the drizzle, but her instincts were screaming. She'd felt it 3 blocks ago, the weight of eyes on her back. The hum of an engine staying just far enough behind to seem coincidental. Headlights that dimmed whenever she glanced over her shoulder. She'd grown up in neighborhoods where survival meant reading danger before it announced itself, where her brother Mateo had drilled warnings into her like prayers. Sarah, men in black cars don't follow you for directions. If you see them twice, run. If you see them 3 times, they already know where you live. Mateo was gone now, buried 5 years under a headstone she could barely afford to visit. But his voice remained, sharp and insistent in moments like these. Sarah slowed near a corner bakery, its windows dark and grated. In the reflection, she caught it, the black SUV, idling half a block back, tinted windows concealing whoever sat inside. Her heart hammered, but her face stayed calm. Fear was a language she'd learned to hide. Inside the SUV, Rico drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, watching the maid pause at the bakery window. "She's looking," Tane muttered from the passenger seat, sinking lower. "Think she made us. She's tired. Paranoid neighborhood. Doesn't mean anything." But Rico's voice lacked conviction. "Boss just said to follow her. She's not doing anything wrong. Why are we even?" "Because he said so." Rico's earpiece crackled to life. "Status." Darian's voice was low, clipped. "Still on her. No stops. No contacts." Rico hesitated. "She keeps looking back, though. Might be spooked." Silence. Then, "Stay close." The line went dead. Tane shook his head. "Something about this feels off." Rico didn't answer because he agreed. 6 months of vetted staff, and suddenly the boss thinks the maid is dirty? The quietest woman in the mansion, who never spoke unless spoken to, who scrubbed floors like she was erasing sins. Ahead, Sarah moved again, turning abruptly down a narrow side street. One Rico knew dead-ended at a chain-link fence and empty loading docks. "She's trapping herself," Tane said, confused. "Or trapping us." Rico eased the SUV forward, engine purring through the mist. The alley swallowed her whole, darkness pressing in from both sides. He stopped at the entrance, headlights cutting through the gloom. And then she stopped walking. Just stopped. In the middle of the alley, rain pooling around her worn sneakers, Sarah Demore turned slowly to face the SUV. Her umbrella hung limp at her side. Her eyes found the windshield, couldn't see through it, but stared anyway, directly at where Rico sat frozen behind the wheel. When she spoke, her voice carried clear and cold through the rain. "If you're going to follow me, at least have the decency to show your face." Rico's breath caught. Tane cursed under his breath. In his mansion office, Darian stood motionless, the radio transmission echoing in his ear. Her voice, calm, fearless, unforgettable. Not the voice of someone guilty. The voice of someone who'd looked danger in the eye before and refused to blink. For the first time in years, Darian Voss felt doubt flicker through his certainty like a crack in ice. "Boss." Rico's voice crackled through. "What do we do?" Darian didn't answer immediately. He replayed her words in his mind, the steady defiance in them, and felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt since he'd learned that trust was the first casualty of power. "Stay where you are," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "I'm coming." Rico pushed open the SUV door, stepping into the rain with his hands visible, palms out, a gesture meant to calm rather than threaten. "Listen, we're not here to." The gunfire came before he could finish. The first shot shattered the SUV's rear window. The second carved a line through the brick wall beside Sarah's head, spraying concrete dust into the fog. She didn't scream. She moved. In the half-second it took Rico to process the ambush, Sarah was already launching herself toward him, her small frame colliding with his chest and sending them both crashing behind a rusted dumpster. Pain flared hot across her shoulder as something tore through her coat, a graze, burning like lightning. "Stay down," she screamed, her voice raw. More gunfire erupted from the alley's far end, muzzle flashes illuminating 3 figures advancing through the mist. The Covalent Syndicate's colors. Darian's enemies had been watching too. Tane returned fire from behind the SUV, glass exploding around him. "We got company. Need backup now." Sarah pressed Rico against the dumpster, her body between him and the shooters, trembling not from fear but adrenaline. Blood soaked through her coat sleeve, warm and spreading, but she didn't move. Couldn't. If she did, Rico would be exposed. "What are you?" Rico started, eyes wide with shock. "Shut up and stay alive." Tires shrieked. Marek's reinforcement car skidded around the corner, doors flying open as 2 more of Darian's men opened fire with practiced precision. The rival crew scattered, retreating into the fog as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving only shell casings and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos. Darian's car arrived 3 minutes later, tires spraying rain as it lurched to a halt. He stepped out before it fully stopped, his expression carved from stone, eyes scanning the wreckage, shattered glass, bullet holes, blood on the pavement. Then he saw her. Sarah sat against the dumpster, medic already wrapping her shoulder, but she waved him off impatiently. Her coat hung in tatters, face pale, but eyes blazing with something that looked dangerously close to rage. Rico stood beside her, visibly shaken, jacket stained dark red. Boss, I can see what she did. Darian's voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah's gaze locked onto him across the alley, recognition flashing through her shock. The man from the mansion. The one whose home she cleaned, whose dishes she washed, whose orders had put her here. She pushed herself up, swaying slightly, and walked toward him with deliberate steps. Every guard tensed, but Darian raised a hand. Wait. When she stopped in front of him, rain streaming between them, her words came out cold and precise. Tell your boss next time he wants me followed. He should do it himself. She turned before he could respond, shouldering past Merrick toward the waiting ambulance. Darian stood frozen, rain soaking through his expensive suit. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. Around him, his men waited for orders that didn't come. His eyes tracked her retreating form, the blood-stained coat, the defiant set of her shoulders, the way she'd looked at him not with fear, but with fury. Rico approached hesitantly. Boss, she saved my life. Took a bullet for her. I know. Darian's gaze fell to Rico's jacket, the dark stains spreading across the fabric. Her blood. Evidence of something he couldn't explain, couldn't control. A maid who should have run had stayed. Had bled. For one of his. For the first time in a decade, Darian Voss felt the ground shift beneath his carefully constructed empire. He wasn't the observer anymore. He was invested. Find out everything about her. Darian's voice cut through the mansion's silence at 3 a.m., his office bathed in the blue glow of city lights. Merrick stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to question the order or simply obey. Everything, boss. Birth records, employment history, medical, everyone she's ever known. Darian didn't look up from the window. I want to know why a maid throws herself in front of bullets. By dawn, the files arrived. Darian spread them across his desk like autopsy reports, each document revealing layers of a woman he'd dismissed as invisible. Birth certificate, Sarah Elise Damore, born in Aurelia's South District. Employment records, 5 years as a trauma nurse at Mercy General Hospital, exemplary performance until... His finger stopped on the termination report. Reason for dismissal, unauthorized treatment of gunshot victim with suspected criminal affiliation. Patient survived. Employee terminated immediately per hospital policy. The date caught his eye. 2 years ago. The patient's description matched one of his crew members, a low-level dealer who'd taken a bullet during a turf dispute. Darian remembered the incident. The man had refused to go to a hospital, showed up 3 days later somehow stitched and stable. She'd saved one of his before. He flipped deeper. Family records. One brother listed, Eliam Damore. Deceased. Darian's chest tightened as he read the death certificate. 3 years ago. Warehouse District. Crossfire during a Voss syndicate operation. A shipment dispute that had turned bloody when a rival crew ambushed his men. Collateral damage. A civilian caught between bullets that had nothing to do with him. The irony tasted like ash. She'd lost her brother to his empire. Lost her career saving his soldier. And still, when bullets flew, she'd chosen to bleed for one of his own. Why? Across the city, in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked like chains, Sarah sat on her bathroom floor, rewrapping her shoulder with shaking hands. The medic's bandage had held, but pain pulsed with every breath. She'd refused the hospital. Hospitals meant questions, records, police reports. She'd learned years ago that survival meant staying invisible. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, Rico stood in the hallway, hands in his pockets, looking more uncertain than any enforcer should. She opened the door a crack. You shouldn't be here. I know. He shifted uncomfortably. I just wanted to say thank you. For what you did. If you need anything, money, protection, a new place. I don't. You took a bullet for me. I took a graze. Sarah's voice was flat. And I didn't do it for you. Rico blinked. Then why? Because someone had to break the cycle. She started to close the door, then paused. Tell your boss to stop sending people. I'm not interested in his gratitude. The door clicked shut, leaving Rico alone in the hallway with more questions than he'd arrived with. That night, Darian stood at his office window, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom built on compromises and blood. Sarah's file sat open on his desk, her photograph paper clipped to the front, a hospital ID badge, her younger face smiling in scrubs. Before he'd taken everything from her, he picked up the file, thumb tracing the edge of her name. 3 years ago, his operation had killed her brother. 2 years ago, she'd saved his man anyway. Last night, she'd bled for another. The pattern didn't make sense. Revenge, he understood. Fear, he expected. But this impossible mercy that defied every rule he'd built his life around. Darian's reflection stared back at him from the rain-streaked glass, and for the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man looking back. "Who are you, Sarah Demore?" he whispered to the empty room. But the city kept its secrets, and the woman who'd rewritten his assumptions slept across town, still bleeding for reasons he couldn't yet name. The rain came harder that night, turning Sarah's street into a river of reflected neon. She was folding laundry when the knock came, too deliberate to be a neighbor, too measured to be a threat. Through the peephole, Darian Voss stood alone, suit soaked through, rain streaming down his face like penance. Her breath caught. Every instinct screamed to pretend she wasn't home, to let the most dangerous man in Aurelia stand in the rain until he gave up and left. Instead, she opened the door. "Mr. Voss." Her voice stayed steady despite her racing pulse. "You knew who I was." Not a question. An accusation wrapped in something that sounded almost like hurt. "All along, you knew exactly who you worked for." Sarah leaned against the doorframe, bandaged shoulder aching. "Everyone in this city knows who you are." "Then why?" He took a step closer, water pooling at his feet. "Why save one of mine? After what we—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "After what happened to your brother?" The air between them crystallized. So he knew. Of course he knew. Men like Darian Voss didn't ask questions without already knowing the answers. "Come in," she said quietly. "You're flooding my hallway." He hesitated, a king uncertain of stepping into a peasant's domain, then crossed the threshold. Her apartment was small, clean, nothing like the mansion he'd grown used to. Everything was second-hand but cared for, each item chosen out of necessity rather than desire. Sarah closed the door and turned to face him, arms crossed. "You want to know why I saved Rico?" "Yes." "Because I couldn't stand there and watch someone die." Her voice was sharp, cutting. "Even if they belonged to you. Even if your empire took my brother. Even if it cost me everything I'd worked for." Darian's eyes narrowed. "The hospital. You treated one of my men. And lost my career for it." She didn't flinch. But he was bleeding out on a gurney, and everyone else had walked away because he had gang tattoos. "So I made a choice. A choice that destroyed your life. A choice that let me sleep at night." Sarah stepped closer, and Darian found himself unable to retreat. "You live in a world where mercy is weakness, where loyalty is currency, where everyone's disposable. I refuse to become that." The silence stretched between them, charged with something neither could name. Not quite attraction, not quite fear, something rawer, more dangerous. "Your brother," Darian started, "was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "I know." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "I've read the police reports. Obsessed over them for months, wondering if someone could have saved him the way I saved Rico. But that's the difference between us, Mr. Voss." "What difference?" "You ask why save them. I ask how could I not?" Darian stared at her, this small woman with a wounded shoulder and eyes that refused to look away, and felt something fracture inside his carefully constructed walls. She wasn't afraid of him, wasn't impressed by him. She simply saw him, all of him, and chose mercy anyway. It terrified him more than any rival ever had. He turned toward the door, hand on the knob, then paused. "Why do you still work for me?" "Because I need the money. And because running from you won't change what you are." He left without another word, descending the stairs into the rain-drenched street. His car waited at the curb, Merrick behind the wheel, but Darian stood there, soaked and shaking. "I don't know if I want to thank her," he whispered to the storm, "or run from her." But he knew, deep down, that running was no longer an option. She'd already gotten inside. The transmitter was small, no bigger than a coin, wrapped in electrical tape and broadcasting on a frequency Darian's security team traced straight to the Covalent Syndicate. And it had been hidden behind Sarah Damour's dresser. "Are you certain?" Darian's voice was ice over the phone, standing in his office while Merrick delivered the news. "Positive, boss." Her room, behind the furniture. "Been active for weeks." The line went dead. Within minutes, Darian was moving through the mansion's corridors like a storm given human form, Rico and Tane flanking him, hands resting on concealed weapons. Servants scattered at his approach, sensing the violence coiled beneath his controlled stride. He didn't knock. The door to Sarah's small quarters slammed open, and there she stood, not cowering, not fleeing, simply waiting in the center of the room, a small device wrapped in cloth resting in her open palm. "Looking for this?" Her voice was steady, but exhaustion shadowed her eyes. Darian raised his gun with practiced efficiency, the barrel finding her chest. Behind him, Rico tensed, remembering her blood on his jacket. Tane's hand moved toward his weapon, but stopped, uncertain. "How long?" Darian's voice was barely above a whisper, deadlier for its quietness. "How long have you been feeding them information?" "I'm not." "The transmitter was in your room." "Because they planted it here when they broke in last night." Sarah took a step forward, and 3 guns rose in response. She didn't stop. "You think I'm stupid enough to hide a bug in my own quarters? You think if I was the mole, I'd still be here? People do stupid things when they're desperate. Then you don't know me at all." The words hit harder than any bullet. Darian's finger rested on the trigger, muscle memory screaming to pull, to eliminate the threat, to restore control. He'd killed for less, built his empire on the bodies of those who'd betrayed him. But his hand wouldn't move. "It's not mine," Sarah repeated, her voice cracking just slightly. "They broke in, trashed my things. I found it this morning when I was cleaning up the mess your security somehow missed." Convenient story. "Then don't believe me." She stepped closer, close enough that the gun barrel pressed against her bandaged shoulder. Her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "I expect you to finish what you started. Pull the trigger, Mr. Voss. Isn't that what men like you do?" The servant's wing had gone silent. Even Rico had stopped breathing. Darian's jaw clenched. Every instinct cultivated through years of survival, every lesson learned in blood, demanded he shoot. She was a liability, a risk. Evidence pointed to betrayal. But her eyes held no guilt, no fear, only that same infuriating clarity that had pierced him in her apartment. "You ask why save them. I ask how could I not?" His hand trembled, imperceptibly, but there. Behind him, Rico and Tane exchanged glances. Their boss had never hesitated before. Never. Slowly, Darian lowered the gun. The weapon hung at his side, suddenly weighing more than it ever had. "You should have been afraid of me, Sarah," he said quietly, voice rough with something that might have been regret. She held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Maybe that's why you can't shoot." The truth of it settled between them like a verdict. Darian turned sharply to his men. "Search every room in this wing. Find out who had access last night. I want security footage from every angle." He walked past Sarah without another word, but as he reached the doorway, he paused. "If I find out you're lying." "You won't," she interrupted. "Because I'm not." He left her standing there, still holding the transmitter, her courage a weight he couldn't shake. For the first time in his reign, Darian Voss had chosen mercy over certainty, and it terrified him far more than any betrayal ever could. The ambush came 3 days later during what should have been a routine collection run. The Covalent Syndicate had been waiting, turning a narrow industrial street into a killbox. Darian's driver took 2 bullets before the car careened into a loading dock. By the time backup arrived, Darian had already dragged himself out through shattered glass, pressing his hand against the wound in his side, blood seeping between his fingers with each labored breath. He should have gone to his private doctor, should have called Merrick, should have returned to the fortress of his mansion where armed men stood ready to protect him. Instead, he drove himself across the city, vision blurring at the edges, and ended up at a weathered apartment building where a woman who'd once bled for his man lived behind a paint-chipped door. Sarah heard the collapse before the knock, a heavy thud against her doorframe, then silence. She opened the door to find Darian Voss slumped against the wall, suit soaked dark with blood, his face pale as death. Jesus! She caught him as he started to slide, his weight nearly taking them both down. What the hell were you thinking? Wasn't, he managed, voice barely audible. Just drove. She dragged him inside, terror and training warring in her chest. Her hands moved on autopsy, checking the wound, assessing blood loss, calculating whether he'd survive long enough for her to work. Stay with me, she commanded, laying him on her kitchen floor, the same floor where she'd confronted him days ago. Don't you dare die in my apartment. Her medical kit appeared, kept from her nursing days, a ghost of the life she'd lost. Needle, thread, antiseptic. Her hands trembled as she cut away his shirt, exposing the bullet wound, but muscle memory steadied them. Darian's eyes drifted, consciousness slipping. Sarah, his voice cracked. Need to tell you. Save your strength. I need to stitch this. No. His hand found hers, grip weak but insistent. It was my crew. The warehouse, 3 years ago. Your brother. Her hands froze over the wound. We were moving weapons. Covalent hit us. Firefight broke out. He coughed, blood flecking his lips. Civilian got caught in the crossfire. We didn't know, didn't see him until... Stop. Her voice broke. You deserve to know. Deserve to know who you saved. Silence filled the small kitchen, broken only by his labored breathing and the distant wail of sirens blocks away. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she'd held back for 3 years, grief rising like a tide. But her hands didn't stop working. Thread pierced skin. Stitches formed with practiced precision. Maybe, she whispered finally, saving Rico was fate's way of giving me a choice. Darian's eyes found hers through the haze of pain. What choice did you make? To end the cycle. She tied off the final stitch. Someone had to. He stared at her. This woman's stitching closed the wound of a man whose empire had destroyed her family, whose confession should have made her drive the needle deeper instead of healing. You should hate me, he whispered, consciousness fading. Sarah sat back, hands bloody, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the kingpin, not the monster, but a man bleeding on her kitchen floor, broken by the weight of his own sins. Maybe I do, she replied softly, wiping her hands. But I'm tired of hating. Darian's eyes closed, her words following him into darkness, not as condemnation, but as something far more dangerous. Grace. And for the first time since he'd built his empire on other people's graves, Darian Voss felt the possibility of redemption. Aurelia burned. Not literally. Not yet. But the city reeked of gasoline and impending violence. The Covalent Syndicate had declared open war after their failed hit on Darian, and every corner of Voss territory became contested ground. Shipments intercepted. Safe houses torched. 3 of his lower-level dealers found dead in alleyways with Covalent signatures carved into their skin. The response should have been immediate. Overwhelming. Biblical. Instead, Darian sat in his office, staring at nothing while his empire waited for orders that didn't come. Boss. Rico stood in the doorway, Tane behind him, both men coiled with barely restrained fury. We need to move. Covalent's hitting our supply lines. If we don't respond now, I know what they're doing. Then let us hit back. Hard. Make an example. No. The word fell like a guillotine blade. Rico and Tane exchanged glances, the kind of look that said something's wrong with him. Boss, with respect, they're making us look weak. Your captains are asking questions. If we don't. I said no. Darian's voice was steel, but it lacked the cold certainty that had once defined him. Set up a meeting. Neutral ground. I'll talk to them. Talk. Tane's voice rose in disbelief. They killed 3 of ours and you want to talk. That's the order. The silence that followed was louder than gunfire. Sarah found him that night on the mansion's rooftop terrace, a place she'd only cleaned but never occupied. He stood at the edge, city lights spreading before him like a kingdom of broken promises, smoke rising from fires he'd once have started himself. "Your men think you've gone soft," she said quietly, joining him at the railing. "My men are probably right." Below, sirens wailed. A warehouse in Covalent territory had caught fire. Retaliation from one of his captains acting without orders. The chaos was spreading, control slipping through his fingers like water. "You could end this," Sarah said. "One word, and your empire crushes theirs." "I know. So why don't you?" Darian turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, uncertainty. The man who'd held a gun to her chest now looked like he was drowning in his own legend. "Because you asked me not to." His voice was barely audible over the wind. "You said I could end this without killing anyone, that I could build something new. And you believed me. I don't know what I believe anymore." He laughed hollow. "But I know that the moment I ordered my men to follow you, everything changed. You bled for people who destroyed your life. You stitched me back together after I confessed to killing your brother. If you can choose mercy." He stopped, jaw clenched. "Then maybe I can too," Sarah finished softly. "My empire is fracturing. My captains are questioning my leadership. There's a vote happening behind my back about whether I'm still fit to rule." Darian's hands gripped the railing. "Everything I built is crumbling because I can't pull the trigger anymore. Maybe that's not weakness." Sarah stepped closer. "Maybe that's the first strong thing you've done. They'll come for me. When they realize I've changed, they'll come. Let them." She touched his hand, the first deliberate contact between them that wasn't born from violence or necessity. "You said you're done running from your own shadow. Then don't." Darian stared at their joined hands, then at the burning city, then back at the woman who dismantled his entire worldview with quiet defiance. "I don't know how to be anything other than this," he admitted. "Then learn." Her fingers tightened around his. "I'll teach you." Below, the city burned with the old world's dying gasps. Above, two people stood at the edge of everything, choosing a different fire entirely. The war didn't end with gunfire. It ended with a handshake in a warehouse under fluorescent lights, witnessed by men who'd expected bloodshed and got paperwork instead. Territory lines redrawn. Reparations agreed upon. A peace treaty signed in the language of criminals trying to become something less monstrous. Darian's captains called it weakness. The streets called it unprecedented. The Covalent Syndicate called it survival. Darian called it breathing. 3 days after the treaty, he found Sarah leaving her shift at the mansion, twilight painting Aurelia in shades of amber and shadow. She paused when she saw him waiting by the gate. No guards flanking him, no weapons visible, just a man in a worn jacket who looked more exhausted than dangerous. "Waiting for someone?" she asked, a hint of smile touching her lips. "You." He fell into step beside her, hands in his pockets. "Walk with me." They moved through streets that knew his name but didn't recognize this version of him. Quieter, smaller, almost ordinary. Neither spoke until they reached the alley where bullets had once flown and her blood had stained the ground. Darian stopped, pulling something from his pocket. A small silver bullet, polished until it gleamed. "The one from your coat," he explained, placing it in her palm. "The medics kept it. I've been carrying it since that night." Sarah stared at the bullet, this tiny piece of metal that had torn through fabric and flesh. Marking the moment everything changed. "You bled for me once," Darian said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of every choice that had led them here. "Let me live for you." Her fingers closed around the bullet, then reached up to touch the scar on his side where her stitches had held him together. The intimacy of the gesture, her hand against his ribs, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palm, shattered the last distance between them. "You don't need to live for me, Darian." Her voice was soft but certain. "Just with me." The words hung in the cooling air like a benediction. He cupped her face with hands that had dealt violence for so long they'd forgotten gentleness, and kissed her under the flickering streetlight. It wasn't the kiss of a kingpin claiming territory. It was fragile, honest, real. The kiss of a man who'd spent years building walls finally tearing them down. When they parted, both trembling slightly, the world seemed to exhale. Down the street, Rico and Merrick sat in an idling car, officially on security detail. Rico started to look, then deliberately turned away. Merrick followed suit. Even they understood some moments weren't meant for witnesses. Your empire won't forgive you for choosing peace, Sarah whispered against his chest. Then I'll build a smaller kingdom. Darian's arms tightened around her. One where I'm not king. Just myself. And who is that? For the first time in memory, Darian Voss smiled. Not the predatory smirk that had preceded violence, not the calculated expression that masked intent, but something genuine and broken and beautiful. The smile of a man who'd walked through his own hell and emerged on the other side, scarred but breathing. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I'd like to find out. With you. Sarah looked up at him. This man who'd ordered her followed and held guns to her chest and confessed sins that should have destroyed any chance of forgiveness. She saw past the tattoos and the reputation, past the empire crumbling at his feet, and glimpsed something impossible. The Mafia boss who became human again. Then let's start with dinner, she said, smiling. Somewhere that doesn't serve on fine china. He laughed, actually laughed, and the sound carried through Aurelia's streets like a promise. The city would remember Darian Voss as a kingpin, but Sarah D'Amour would know him simply as Darian. And in the end, that was the only empire worth building. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is lay down his weapons. Darian Voss learned that mercy isn't weakness. It's the courage to break cycles that others are too afraid to challenge. Sarah D'Amour proved that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can rewrite the future. In a world built on violence, they chose something harder, grace. Love didn't make Darian soft. It made him human. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous transformation of all. If this story moved you, subscribe to Mafia Soul for more tales where love rewrites the rules of power. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes even the darkest hearts can find redemption. Next time, we dive into another world where loyalty is tested and love changes everything. Until then, stay dangerous, stay human. These stories are born in the shadows and told with the heart. See you in the next video.